So I'm very excited to talk to you about concept-based nursing curriculum. As you may or may not know, the concept-based model has been around in nursing for 15 years, with the first one starting in 2004 at the University of New Mexico. And it got a slow start. I would say in the past 5 years, we're seeing quite an escalation in the number of concept-based nursing programs, primarily at the pre-licensure level, of course. And as we look at how many people are having these concept-based curricula, we see that the best guesstimate is probably around 50 to 60%. Now, I haven't really found any research that supports that, but I will tell you that it's quite common, particularly in associate degree programs. About, I would say, another 10 or 15% of programs are working on it, certainly. And we also see some, I'm sorry, I'm losing my slide, so hang on there with me. So about another 10, 15% are working on developing a CBC. We also know that some are statewide. Some of the states that have the concept-based curriculum are Wyoming, New Mexico, Alabama, Texas. So we're seeing a real growth in this area. I've talked with quite a few graduate faculty about if this is becoming so popular, are they including it into their graduate education courses or curriculum courses? And very few are. A few say they spend about 30 minutes. And so that's why I'm really doing this webinar. Certainly many of your graduates from the master's program are probably going to be employed as educators in associate degree programs. And again, that's where the largest percentage of concept-based programs exist. I will tell you, though, there is a growing BSN interest in this area. So on the next slide, as I'm looking at the curriculum books, and I'm looking at what's available, whatever curriculum books you might be using, and there's several out there. Keating is one and some of the others. I find that these textbooks that are available for your students really don't include content on the concept-based curriculum or conceptual teaching and learning. There'll be a quick mention, perhaps. I believe the Billings book, and probably many of you are using that sort of broad nursing education book for your students, also has a very short page or so on it, but nothing really in depth. So basically, I'm finding that there's a need to include more about the concept-based curriculum because it is so popular, and your students who become nurse educators, new nurse educators, are going to need to know a lot about it. On the next slide, you'll see that I'm just mentioning a little bit about the competency-based curriculum. We are seeing a little bit of a push from the American Association of Colleges of Nursing and CCNE, the accrediting body for BSN and higher programs, that they are pushing for a competency-based curriculum. But I don't believe that the two are mutually exclusive. I'm finding that many programs, particularly BSN programs, are combining and blending these two models. So, for example, evidence-based practice might be a concept in their concept-based curriculum, but the programs, the faculty have established competencies for their students that are aligned with those of AACN, NLN, TUSN, and so forth. So they're not two different things. They can work very well together. Certainly, we have competencies we want our students to demonstrate that relate to the concepts that we select. On the next slide, we'll see, again, really why we need to include this information in your curriculum for your nurse educator curriculum. It's not just because there's so many of them out there and it's growing, but also because K through 12 really got us started in this area of looking at concept-based. There's so much knowledge. The K through 12 educators have been asking themselves for 20 years, how can we include everything that students need to know? And so Lynn Erickson, who is the leader of K through 12 concept-based curriculum, I have authored a reference for you in your reference list, but she's actually written 3 or 4 books and many articles in K through 12 education that really talks about how a concept-based curriculum is based on the latest neurobiology research and how people learn. And we used to think that as people learned in the brain where knowledge is stored, that area got bigger as we garnered and gain new knowledge. But in fact, we know that does not happen, that the knowledge storage area still stays about the same size, but it becomes more dense. So new knowledge is connected with previous knowledge and previous experience, and so it becomes very rich. She also found that we are not paying attention to what we used to call Bloom, now we call it revised Bloom's cognitive level of understanding. And I'm talking to many nurse educators who teach in pre-licensure and RN to BSN programs. I find that many of them believe that if one has the knowledge, one can easily translate that knowledge into practice. And Erickson says that doesn't happen, that even if I know what dyspnea is, doesn't mean that I can go into a clinical setting or a lab setting and recognize that it's happening, know what to do about it, know how to assess it, because if they don't understand the significance of dyspnea and that it's not normal and what I need to do about it and how to assess it, then I'm going to have a hard time translating that knowledge into practice. So that's just really important to think about when you're helping your students learn the cognitive taxonomy, that understanding we now know is more important than it ever has been before. Not that we want to limit our students at that level, but we can't bypass that level and go from a remembering or knowledge level up to application and higher. The other thing she said was that this helps us desaturate our curriculum. And for faculty who are sometimes reluctant to make this big change, because it is a big change for programs, they don't really sometimes understand why we would need to do it. Why can't we just teach traditionally and include everything we always have and continue to add as knowledge explodes? And I like to think about pharmacology. When one teaches pharmacology, whether it be on the advanced level or basic level, the educator cannot possibly teach every drug that exists. Plus, it's changing so quickly, how could we do that? So instead, we teach by drug classifications, major drug classifications, which you might think of as meta-concepts. And then under those classifications, we select a small group of prototypes that represent the drug class. And that would be your exemplars, your examples. So that's really how a concept-based curriculum works. It works for the whole curriculum the way it does in pharmacology. And that if we do a good job of helping students understand and use that knowledge, they'll be able to transfer it to new knowledge. So let's on the next slide talk about some of the terminology, because there's a lot of terminology that's being used synonymously and it really isn't. So when one says concept-based curriculum, one is really talking about a formal curriculum structure or the educational framework of the curriculum. So it's that structure. What does the plan of study look like? What concepts are we going to select? What exemplars for each concept are we going to select? Where are they going to be placed in our courses, in our degree plan? And as Dr. Giddens, who is the modern day founder, pioneer for concept-based nursing curriculum, Jean Giddens, I'm sure you know her name very well, she says that anybody can do the structure. You can go to her concept book or some other concept resources and pick those out. The hard part is learning as an instructor, as an educator, how to make conceptual learning occur. Conceptual learning is the process. How are the students going to learn in this environment? How are we going to prepare them to learn in this environment? How is the curriculum operationalized? So it's really most important, no matter what the structure looks like. And I have to tell you, the structure varies from program to program. Some things are the same, but some are different. And again, Dr. Giddens says that's fine. Select what works for you, select what works for your program, what works for your students. But the conceptual learning part is the hard part. Most of us have not gone through programs in which our educators, our instructors helped us learn conceptually. We were more of a traditional lecture environment, many of us, whether that was online or in class. So this is something new that educators have to learn, and I would encourage you to help your students learn how to teach conceptually and how to facilitate conceptual learning. On the next slide is a little bit more detail about the CBC, and that is a concept-based curriculum, and this comes from the literature, and I did give you some references. It should facilitate deep understanding and learning. A new term that's being used now instead of deep learning is retrieval learning, that we all have knowledge that gets somewhat buried, but using concepts or triggers, we can retrieve that learning because it's deep and it sticks with us, and that's really important. Also, deep learning is different than superficial learning. Superficial learning is memorization, dump it for the test, and then I'm on to the next topic. And I can tell you, as a person who has taught in pre-licensure and RN to BSN education more than any other level, I have found that students do not remember. They don't remember their A&P. I'm sure you've seen that even in your programs, that they don't remember some of those basic support courses and core courses that they took. They don't remember the information. And that's because there was a lot of information they got through the course or through the program by memorization, and then they don't have it to stick with them that they can retrieve. The good CBC also enhances the ability to apply, or the word I like better is from Dr. Benner in 2010 in her study, in which she said that we want our students, our learners, to translate knowledge, and to translate that knowledge in different situations, clinically, in different contexts, in the community, wherever we want them to translate it, we have to understand what that is. She also uses the term contextual learning, and that's very popular now in the literature, in the educational literature. We talk a lot about contextual learning. But again, this is only going to occur if the learner has deep understanding. On the next slide, you'll see sort of a little blurb on what a conceptual learning environment's about. If you could just back up one, Jen. Thank you. This is what Erickson, again, K through 12, said about conceptual learning, that in a conceptual learning environment, your learner is able to organize content because we help them organize it, create connections, and connections is just a key word in learning. Dating back to the mid-'80s, where Novak and Gowan created the concept map and explained the value of concept mapping is because it allows students, the learner, to make connections. When you make connections, you're learning, you're thinking, and she says critical thinking, which we've talked about in nursing for over 20 years, is just so crucial, and we still haven't gotten to where we want to be. She also says that if you can problem solve or make decisions, it helps you, the conceptual learning helps you make decisions and problem solve. So on the next slide, you'll see the learning definition for nursing, conceptual learning for nursing definition. This just came out this year, and so there's an excellent article at the end of your slide by Fletcher and I think it's her colleagues, in which the researchers did a systematic review to make a definition of conceptual learning in nursing. Because we had Erickson and we have other writers, but we didn't have one thing. So this is an actual quote. Again, I've shared the reference with you, but it's a process. And, you know, I should be able to see that going on when I walk into a conceptual learning classroom. I should be able to walk into a classroom and see the conceptual learning that's occurring, because I'll see learners organize concept-relevant knowledge, skills, and attitudes, which we always talk about in the 3 learning domains, that they're making cognitive connections that are logical, they're retrieving and able to transfer concepts to situations that are familiar and unfamiliar. So I really like this definition because it makes sense, and it is evidence-based. Then what is conceptual teaching? On the next slide, you'll see that this is what the teacher does, right? This is what the educator does. And I think a lot of people I've heard talk about a concept-based or concept-based concept teaching environment, they use the word flipped classroom, and I don't think they are the same. I think one can have a flipped classroom without doing concept-based or being conceptual in the classroom, and I think that one can teach conceptually and not have a flipped classroom. I personally found that this innovative approach sometimes becomes so innovative that we think flipping is the best way to go, and then I found that my students flipped. They didn't want to flip classroom because it means they They want to hear from me. They want to have me share with them my thoughts and help them highlight the most important information, help them understand what they're trying to learn. And I think that's a key word that I like in this description of conceptual teaching, is that we have to ensure meaningful learning through engaging activities. Yes, we all talk about active learning, but we have to give them activities that allow them to apply those patterns of knowing in a variety of ways and make those connections. I also would tell you that I think a scrambled classroom, or a classroom which we sometimes refer to as a change-up, is an outstanding way. It doesn't have to be totally flipped. A scrambled or a change-up classroom is one, and I don't know if you've heard that terminology or not, but it is in the educational literature, is one in which the students do activities, the facilitator, the educator, debriefs in a meaningful way, and perhaps provide some additional information to enrich the classroom, the knowledge that's being learned and understood and applied. And then they go back and do another activity, and then there's debriefing. Debriefing has become a very important concept that we need to use in education, not just in the simulation environment, because that's where it really came from, but also in every environment that we're in, every learning environment we're in. So if it's a classroom, if it's online, if it's doing lab skills, if it's doing clinical, we need to have debriefing time so students can learn, because all of these are learning environments for sure. So on the next two slides, well, we'll take one at a time. The next slide is the classic book that you may have your students use now by Giddens, Caputi, and Rogers. Betty Rogers is an expert in concept analysis. And so she joined that team to put this book together. And I really thought this was going to be the how-to book, because we had the book on concepts. We did not really have a how-to book. But what I found was that book was lacking, and that is why I've created the book on this next slide. That's Teaching and Learning in a Concept-Based Curriculum. So on the next slide, you'll see the title of my book. Sorry, Jen, I didn't mean to confuse you there. And this book I wrote because I think graduate faculty, when I see them become new educators in programs where I consult, they don't know anything about a concept-based curriculum. They proudly tell me they have their master's in nursing education, which is awesome, and they're being prepared as educators, but they don't know anything about a concept-based curriculum, or they only got 30 minutes on it in a curriculum course. So I wrote the book that I thought would be helpful for students in a graduate program, also to assist faculty who are teaching or want to think about teaching in a concept-based curriculum. So it's really two-pronged, but we really want to get this into graduate students' hands as a supplemental text, but required text for curriculum courses, because curriculum course books, as I mentioned before, don't have a how-to about concept-based. So let me tell you a little bit about why I think this book will be ideal for your students. On the next slide, you'll see an overview of the highlights of the book. And because I wrote it for students, it's student-friendly with chapter learning outcomes, many boxes and tables that pull out the most pertinent information. Remember this features that really point out the key pieces I want them to remember as they're reading. End of chapter key points, and then the chapter references are not only current and comprehensive, but they do include what research we have. And we don't have a lot, but we do have some pieces of research related to the effectiveness of the concept-based curriculum and conceptual learning. So if I were teaching your course and I wanted to teach about concept-based curriculum, this is how I would use my book. So in the next few slides, we'll go over that, but we'll take it one at a time. So you may not want to do it in this particular order, but these are just the topics or subtopics I would include. How do you develop a nursing CBC? Your students may work in a program that's converting to a concept-based curriculum, and they need to know how to do it. And literally, I developed a 12-step model that will help them, walk them through what needs to be done. I want to mention here that it's been my experience in some programs I've been in that they call me up to talk about concept-based curriculum or wanting to move in that direction. And they tell me that they selected concepts and now they're stuck. And so then I go back and say, well, did you revisit your philosophy? Did you look at your mission? Does it support conceptual learning? What is your belief about adult teaching and learning? No, they didn't do that. They didn't know they should do that. So this really reminds one that if you're going to do a massive overhaul of your curriculum, you can't just start in the middle, that there really is a sequence, although some steps could be flipped around. Basically, you start with the underpinning of any curriculum, which is philosophy and mission. And so we have to go back and revisit that to see if it supports what we're doing. Chapter 2, and you'll notice this isn't in order of the book, because you don't have to be, right? It was a novel. Is really what's the difference between traditional teaching and conceptual learning. And teaching and learning are different. Teaching is what I do, learning is what the student does. And we know that we can teach all day, doesn't mean they learn. So I talk about that. I talk about the attributes of conceptual learning, which I could add the Fletcher information that just came out last month. Might be a fun thing for us to put on the blog or something for you guys as a supplement to this webinar. Then teaching and learning in a concept-based classroom or online. I have a chapter in chapter 5 on what kinds of activities and why you would do those activities in a classroom. And then we have a chapter about online teaching as well, teaching and learning. On the next slide, it continues, because one thing we know is that to be a really successful concept-based curriculum, all learning environments need to be conceptually based. And I have encountered where a few programs have said, we're going to change our classroom to concept-based, but we're not going to change clinical. And that is really disturbing when you think about it, because Dr. Benner, in her huge study, definitely made the point that we have to connect clinical and classroom, or the didactic. So there is a chapter on how do you make that clinical learning environment come alive, and what does that look like? And that means that you're not really there for the purpose of being the nurse, but rather learning. So often my students would tell me they're done, they've done their care and they're done, and they're hanging around. And if you purposely structure a clinical learning environment, it's much more meaningful, with direct care activities with patients, as well as focused learning activities which support what the care is all about. So that's really important, and that chapter does a very nice job. It also talks about the importance, if you have multiple faculty in a course who are taking small groups of students into clinical, how you can ensure that everybody's providing the same kinds of experiences and the same outcomes weekly related to conceptual learning. There's some articles as well in that chapter that are quite good about the effectiveness of deep learning in clinical, because that's really where the deepest learning can occur, when you can translate it with real patients. Using concept mapping. Concept mapping has been around, as I said, since the mid-'80s, but it's been used in a variety of ways. This really talks about, and written by a contributor who is probably the leading expert in nursing education on concept mapping, Deanne Block. She did a very nice chapter on how you can use concept mapping, not just for clinical or to replace care plans, but how you use it in groups or individual pairs in the classroom to make those connections, because that's an absolute ideal way to do it and meets all learning styles, all preferences for learning. And then case studies, which are really gaining a lot more attention than earlier, primarily because of the change in the influx that will be occurring in the next few years, where there'll be complex case studies and scenarios on the exam instead of short minute and a half multiple choice and select all that applies. So we should be getting our students ready now for using case studies, but not all case studies are equal. This chapter talks about what attributes of a case study we would want to have, how to put one together, unfolding versus single episode, and of course all about asking meaningful questions that make students think, And many people are saying think like a nurse, so that's sort of a cliche now. And that's what Chapter 9 does. It also introduces the National Council of State Boards of Nursing clinical judgment model, for which case studies are ideal for applying. And then on the last slide, what concept-based content continuing is, okay, so you've done a concept-based for a couple of years, maybe 1 to 3, and you say, let's really look at how well we did. So, of course, I jumped down to the bottom of the slide. I shouldn't have done that. But anyway, Chapter 12 talks about looking at your program and what works and what does not. Also evaluating learning in Chapter 10 and 11. How do you evaluate whether your students have learned conceptually in the concept-based classroom or in the concept-based clinical setting? So all of those pieces are pieces that I think are so important to include. You notice I did mention 2 chapters. There were 12 chapters, and I think I mentioned 10 of them. But chapters 1 and 4 are review chapters. So chapter 1, for example, is just, what are the components of a curriculum? And then I find that many graduate students who come out of school do not, perhaps this isn't true where you are, but some programs have not helped them really learn how to write good student learning outcomes. And that's so important for evaluating learning. And then how to write them conceptually, because instead of focusing on medical diseases at the undergraduate level anyway, generalist level, we want them to focus on the concepts. So that's the good review for them. So the next slide shares with you some of the references I've been talking about. Again, that's one of the best Erickson books right there, which you can get on Amazon. She also has a newer book that she co-authored more on the teaching part, but it's really very K-12-ish. 2007, this book isn't as much focusing on K-12. It focuses more on just the idea of how you get conceptual learning to occur in the classroom. And then the Fletcher article that I mentioned that literally came out this month, very ideal for this webinar, where using the Avant and Walker concept analysis guide, did a concept analysis of conceptual learning. So that's quite good. Talks about the attributes, talks about the antecedents, the consequences, and so forth. So it's an excellent resource. And then the last 2, of course, are the 2 that I referenced earlier with the more theoretical master and concept-based teaching, and then my own. So at this point, I'd like to be open to questions. Thank you so much for attending, and I hope you have some good questions for me.
Thanks so much, Donna. Just going to put it up on the last slide here. If you're interested in getting a copy of the book, you can save 25% today if you're getting that for your own personal use. If you would like to have your rep contact you, they will be reaching out to you post-webinar, and then Donna has graciously added her contact information in case you have any questions that come up. And we'll give just a couple of minutes to see if anybody has any questions. We don't have anything in the queue right now. And as I had mentioned just in our opening, we have been recording this session. It will be available on our YouTube channel, and you can find it on the redirect link go.jblearning.com/cbnc2. And Donna, I think you did a great job walking people through step by step with the process that you mentioned toward the latter half of the presentation. If someone were, completely new to this, do you recommend that they start with that 12-step model to actually begin teaching in a concept-based curriculum? Is that the best thing that they should do, or is there any kind of evaluation they need to do of their curriculum and teaching style ahead of time?
I think the best thing to do is to go through the 12-step model and then assess where they are and are they able to do those steps. We certainly know there's some debate in the literature about can you just take a traditional curriculum and turn it into conceptual based without changing the structure. And it's very difficult to do. I've actually had faculty say to me, we really didn't go through the 12 steps. We just took what we have, threw a few concepts in, and it's a concept-based curriculum. And that really is not very effective for your students. really best to go back and really rethink. Not that you have to change your philosophy and mission, but make sure it supports all the other pieces. So there may be things that are in place that you're going to want to keep. I'm never one for throwing out things that work, but how can we make it more adaptive? And by looking at the 12 steps, that's a great place to start.
We do have a question that has come in, Donna, and thank you for answering that and for providing a little bit more in-depth explanation. It says, does your textbook cover how to demonstrate learning that has occurred in the concept-based curriculum teaching? I have to link all learning back to direct learning. So it sounds like maybe this instructor is asking if there is some sort of measurement that you can use. I think so. It says, does the textbook cover how to demonstrate that learning has occurred using that concept-based curriculum methodology? This instructor has to link all learning back to direct learning.
Yeah, so chapters 10 and 11 talk about how you evaluate or measure that conceptual learning has occurred. One chapter focuses on evaluating that in the classroom, and the other chapter focuses on evaluating that into clinical. So yes, there are two chapters that talk about evaluating or measuring learning, and then the last chapter in that part of the book is evaluating the entire program to see its successes, looking at your program outcomes to see if you're getting the outcomes you want.
Great. And another question, you mentioned that your textbook is geared toward graduate students who may be new faculty. Is this also appropriate for new and seasoned faculty who are getting prepared for a curriculum reboot, moving from traditional to concept-based teaching?
Absolutely, absolutely. I've had many faculty. I work with a lot of schools to help them because it's new for some folks, even though it's been around for 15 years. You know how long it takes for things to get really saturated in the market. So yes, absolutely. It is a definite dual purpose. Absolutely a dual purpose book. Actually, initially, I was thinking about writing something just for faculty, and then I realized, wait a minute, we have graduate students who need to know this. We have graduate faculty who need to know, and that's how I arrived at adding the learning outcomes and more student-friendly features that they look for in textbooks. But I've had a lot of positive comments from faculty who've used our book in their own programs.
Thanks, Donna. Let me just see if we have a couple other questions. I did see a comment from someone stating that they had a little bit of trouble with that promotion code coupon. I'll take a look at that just right after we break here, so my apologies for that. Someone else is asking, would this be appropriate for clinical adjunct instructors orienting them to a concept-based curriculum?
Absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, one of the things that I'm doing with some of the schools I've been working with is that we are bringing the adjuncts in, and we're using pieces of my chapters in my book to help them learn not only about what it is, but how they need to understand that what they've been doing traditionally with, pairing up students with nurses for X number of patients on a unit or home health or wherever they are, that there has to be more intentional, purposeful, and deliberate planning that oftentimes they can have input into, but they don't have the ultimate responsibility. Oftentimes they work with a team for their lead instructor or their coordinator, whatever the system is in the program, so that they are all on the same page, and they're held accountable. They're held accountable to make sure certain activities are done, and that students are evaluated weekly on their ability to demonstrate clinical conceptual learning. We don't usually talk a lot about weekly assessments, formative assessments, but they're really crucial. And I'm finding that some programs in the past have used their summative assessments for their weekly, and that really is not the same thing. Formative and summative are different. So we need different kinds of tools, and those formative tools can be very conceptually based. And if adjunct faculty know how to facilitate that learning, and then how to evaluate that learning was demonstrated.
Great. Thanks, Donna. Another great question, and I'm sure this is something that maybe a lot of instructors are wondering. How does concept-based curriculum support NCLEX results?
So when the very first program, and there have been some bad press, there's been some bad press about concept-based dating back from 2004, when the University of New Mexico BSN program implemented their very first one. Over the next couple of years, their NCLEX rates were poor, and people got nervous. I think that might be one of the reasons why it got off to a slow start. In 2006, the state of North Carolina associate degree programs, and they have quite a few, I want to say like 100, implemented their statewide, which is still going on today and has been revised obviously since then. They got the same or better results. I have not heard of any programs that have done more poorly on their NCLEX. If anything, they have improved. Particularly as we think about the fact that the NCLEX can only test the most important information. Gone are the days when some of us sat for, and I'm telling my age, some of us sat for 2 days through testing for what was then called the state boards, and we had very remote, rare disorders included. That is no longer the case. So only the most important, commonly seen health problems are included along with health promotion. So that's what helping with, I think concept-based helps with that, because it gets you to desaturate your curriculum so there's more time spent on the most important content. And I think that's why it has helped the NCLEX rates improve.
Thanks, Donna. That was really helpful. I'm sure that's something that's, definitely on the minds of a lot of our faculty here. And, it looks like we've reached the end of our questions, and I believe we have about a few more minutes left until the top of the hour. But I do just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and especially want to thank Donna for putting together such a great presentation and really sharing your expertise on concept-based nursing curriculums. Again, I will check on that coupon code that we have associated with purchasing the textbook, and the slides as well as a link to the presentation will be made available to everyone who attended as well as registered too. Donna, I don't know if you have any wrap up or any closing before we close out?
Sure. I'd just like to thank you for attending, and most importantly, I hope certainly when we all go to these webinars or conferences and we learn, hopefully you take what you've learned and use it. I think that's the most important part of learning, is changing behavior. I heard somebody say that's the definition of learning, changing behavior. So if we take this information and we use it, we change our curriculum to include this content, I think that would be my hope, because I'm going to tell you, as a consultant who works with undergraduate programs in developing and implementing these curricula, faculty do not have knowledge of how to do it. And so if you can help me with that and include that in your courses, that would be awesome for everybody. The students would certainly benefit. Thank you so much.